All right, Don, so here we go. The last section of this unit right here, 12.3, the collapse of Reconstruction, at the end of Reconstruction. Okay, so we're talking political, economic, and social problems that plagued the nation from 1873. Depression, right? And basically what we're talking about here is why does it fail? Why does it end? Right? Because the nation had poured a lot of resources into rebuilding the South and unifying itself after the war, and they kind of let it go after 1877.
So, if we take a look at Reconstruction and in the South, we have to talk about the opposition to Reconstruction. This is something we talked about briefly last lecture. We talked about different lynchings, Jim Crow laws, and black codes. But one thing to really understand is you might be wondering, well, why would the United States, like Mr. Manelsky just mentioned, why would the United States end Reconstruction after they put all this money and time into it? And one of the reasons was the opposition in the South was so strong that it was really frustrating many of the Northerners who were trying to implement Reconstruction. And one of the many groups is the Ku Klux Klan, and also known as the KKK. Now, this is the only group we're going to talk about. There's also the White League and a couple other groups just sprouted up that did pretty much the same thing. But the KKK really embodies all of the Southern resistance. It was founded immediately after the Civil War by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was actually a very, very cruel Confederate officer.
If you recall, he was the one responsible for the Fort Pillow massacre.
Yeah. So he was a bad dude. But the KKK, or the group that he was planning on founding, wasn't quite what the KKK became. Nathan Bedford Forrest, like many other white Southerners who used to be in power and now find himself not so much, were extremely frustrated by how the social norms had flipped on them, and they wanted to do something about it. So he started this social club to come together to get ideas on how to basically oppress African Americans and keep white Southerners on top of the social ladder, dominating society, politics, and the economy. And then it just sort of spiraled off from there.
Into violence and terrorism and lynchings and all kinds of other stuff that the KKK was responsible for during this time.
Yeah, so real quick, before we move on to check out this map, which is really important, one thing we want to keep in mind is when you think of the KKK, you probably think, the guys in the white hoods, on the horses, burning crosses, and everything else. And yes, they did do that, and much of that came in the 20th century. But they did do things like that in the 19th century, but they had very specific motivations for it. They saw a South that was changing, and they did not want African Americans to own businesses or be successful. So what do? You intimidate them, and you threaten them with violence, and you tell them if they own certain businesses, something could happen to their home or their family. You threaten white business owners who are potentially employing African Americans, or white attorneys who are representing African Americans, or even just white people who live amongst you who are actually treating them well. What happens is you go around at night under the cover of disguise, which, by the way, this is what they used to look like, and you beat those people up, or you threaten them, or you kill them, or you burn down their home. And all of a sudden, they're not employing African Americans. They're not being nice to them because they realized they were being threatened by it. And this extended to politics, too. These threats and this fear prevented them from voting, prevented African Americans from running for office, prevented African Americans from having the audacity to walk on the same sidewalk, or heaven forbid, enter the front door of a white home. It's actually funny because white families in the South, in order to prevent robberies, would lock the back door because no black man would dare walk in their front door. So it was these social norms were so ingrained in society that they were worried about black people stealing from them. But even a black man in the middle of the night would never dare walk in the front door of a white person's home. That's the type of social norms and social hierarchy that the KKK really wanted to re-implement.
Yeah, if we can look at it, this is from the election of 1872, so this is Grant running again. The Army is still there. Right? So the Union, the Federal Army is able to kind of hold the Klan off and protect the rights. So if we're looking here at the election, the light blue is Republican-leaning areas. Right? The dark blue are people that voted for Democrats, or really who was a liberal Republican who ran against Grant. We notice the people that vote for Grant, the areas that are the lightest blue, along the Mississippi River, South Carolina, Central Virginia, Central Alabama, those are the areas where the highest slave population was, you remember from the last lecture's map. Right? So you can see that the Army was still able to protect African American voting rights, even in 1872, even with the threat of the Klan. But we'll see after the Panic of 1873, the North and the federal government becomes a little less focused on Reconstruction.
Yeah. And by dark blue, Mr. Minelski obviously means purple, because it's not dark blue.
You're not going to see it in the light here, it's fine.
Nobody's perfect, especially Mr. Minelski. Right? So, moving on to the re-election of Grant, 1872, you'll see that he dominates the North once again. And like Mr. Minelski was mentioning, those areas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, those areas with high freedmen votes are going to help him win re-election. Of course, they're going to vote for him because he was the one protecting them. But Grant wasn't super popular. Many Republicans actually nominated other candidates to run against him, but the Democrats were so divided, running about 1,000 of their own candidates, it really didn't matter, and Grant won in a total electoral landslide.
The Democrats even nominated the other major Republican, Greeley. Yeah. So the Democrats, he was nominated by two parties for president just because they thought the Democrats would be able to beat Grant if they did that.
And then Georgia and Missouri voted for 3 different Democrats, because of course that's not going to work. And so Grant ran away with the election. But his second term wasn't really as good as his first term. And Ulysses S. Grant is seen as a true American hero, and for good reason. He's the guy that beat Robert E. Lee, even though he lost twice as many men in the process. And he's the guy who graduated from West Point, even though he almost failed out. And he's the guy that served 2 terms as president, even though his second term was full of scandal and corruption. But whatever, Ulysses S. Grant's the man. So,
Grant, I mean, the scandals were terrible. He was either aware of them and did nothing, or so totally incompetent that he allowed his advisors and his cabinet to just willingly break laws. I mean, commit major financial scandals. They were bribing people. The railroad industry took over. The Credit Mobilier scandal was a major impact, especially with the Transcontinental Railroad. We'll get into that later. But the Grant administration was seen as wildly incompetent. He was drunk half the time. He had a drinking problem. Right? And he was getting older. He was sicker. Right? And it just did not go well in his second term.
Yeah, Grant was a great tactician. Grant was a great military mind. Grant was pretty good at organizing people and achieving goals. But the logistical things weren't really his forte. Paperwork and all of the crossing the T's and dotting of the I's wasn't really what he was great at. Like Mr. Minelski mentioned, drunk half the time, maybe, but he definitely had a drinking problem and it really affected his job performance. And like Mr. Minelski mentioned, he was getting older, he was on his way out, he definitely was not in his prime any longer. And the Panic of 1873 is sort of going to be the final nail in Grant's coffin. Just like Martin Van Buren and the Panic of 1837, see, it's sort of easy to remember, so all you have to do is flip the last 2 numbers. Really torpedoed his presidency. The Panic of 1873 torpedoed Grant's. And what had happened is throughout the course of the war, the government was buying all types of supplies, of course, for the army. And they were borrowing money from Europe and borrowing money from other countries, borrowing money from private citizens, and they were just cashing checks and writing checks to these businesses for things that they needed, like food and blankets and clothing and gunpowder and ammo and rifles for the army. Well, these businesses were booming and booming and booming and booming. The railroad businesses were booming because businesses were paying to ship things on the railroad. And so they kept expanding and expanding. But then, about 8 years following the end of the war, they realized they had expanded too much, borrowed too much money, and that big bubble burst. And tens of thousands of businesses went under, hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs.
The unemployment was rampant. I mean, the entire northern economy, that the industrial economy that had been created during the war, just collapsed. And the North became a little less concerned with what was happening in the South.
Exactly. So, moving on, the end of Reconstruction is in the election of 1876, the next presidential election. And what will happen is the Democrats will not be so foolish to run 8 different guys for president, they'll just run one, realizing that that's going to give them a better chance to win. And what happens is the Republicans, in the North primarily, run Rutherford B. Hayes, the Democrats run Samuel J. Tilden. And you'll see that the Democrats gain a huge amount of the voting electorate because the Panic of 1873, the economy is terrible, and Grant handled it poorly. So the Republicans have a black eye at this point. And what eventually happens is 3 states are under dispute. Whoever wins these 3 states wins the election. So they create a commission that has a majority of Republicans, and the commission, shockingly, believes that the Republican candidate, Hayes, should win the election. But they weren't dumb enough to think that Southerners and the Democrats would actually just be okay with this deal. So they realized they had to come to a compromise.
And the compromise is basically redemption and home rule, that the federal government is going to end Reconstruction and take the army out of the South, ending the occupation and allowing for redemption or democratic rule returning to the South. So after this election, basically the Republicans trade Reconstruction and everything, all the policies in there in the South, for the presidency in 1876. And that effectively ends any kind of federal intrusion into the southern states, and that's going to allow Jim Crow and segregation and everything to run rampant throughout that time.
And you might be saying, well, wow, that's a crappy trade. I can't believe they did that. You have to remember, the Panic of 1873 is sapping the economy, and many Northerners are wondering, why am I paying all of these taxes for the government to go reconstruct the South when the South doesn't want to be reconstructed, and I just lost my job, I don't feel like paying for it. So there are very real reasons why Reconstruction ended outside of this election also. But that's the important results, so make sure you keep it in mind. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, please ask your history teacher. Thanks for watching.